started. All right, hey everybody. For those of you that are watching in replay or that are just joining us for the first time, my name is Lindsay Kuyava. I am the Artistic Director of Re-Theater, and this is the Rebellious History of Musical Theater. For those of you that have never done anything with Re-Theater, we are an online theater education and consulting company, and our whole goal is to help inspire educators to make art that matters by finding ways to inspire their young people to explore their world better through musical theater. And we're also hoping to inspire young people to make art that matters by creating work that reflects their world. So I'm so excited that you guys are here. For the month of April, we have been doing this series as well as a brainstorming series, and it's all on a pay what you can basis because we are really committed to ensuring equity in education, and with all of the changing circumstances, we want to make sure as many people can still do this work and be in a community. So with that being said, I always like to start every class by encouraging you to jump over into the comments and introduce yourself and just say where you're from. I know a lot of people that are tuning in live have been here for the last 4 weeks together, but it's always just fun to like go over there, say where you're from. If you want to like say a little bit about what you do, that would be wonderful, because while I'm so excited you're here to learn more about musical theater, I hope that maybe this can be an opportunity for you guys to find connection and community in our love of musical theater. Well, at least I hope you love musical theater because you're here. And so if you hate musical theater, this will be very boring. So great. So I'm going to go ahead and, like always, we're going to have a PowerPoint. So I'm just going to go ahead and start that. But I'm just very excited for today. Which one is the right one? This must be the right one. And oh, nope. Did I do this? Yes, I did. Okay. I'm so bad at technology. I don't think I'm ever going to really get it, but that's okay. Somebody actually like made a joke the other day and like called me a boomer, and I'm like, I don't think that you understand like what that phrase means, because I am not, and this person was older, and I was like, either this is an insult, very big insult to me, or it's an insult to them because they don't understand the phrase. Regardless, that's not the point. So as I said, this course is called The Rebellious History of Musical Theater. We are looking at the people and the performers and stories that defied social norms to define what it is we love about musical theater today. So today is part 4 of a 5-part series, and we are looking at the creatives that defined musical theater. As we go through this, if anybody that is tuning in live, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to put them over in the chat. I will be stopping throughout, but I do try my best not to like go look in the chat because then I get very scatterbrained. So go ahead and throw any comments or questions you have over there, and we can answer those when we get there. All right, so for those of you that tuned in before, you've seen these couple slides, but let's go through them quickly. So the goals of this course are to help us understand that musical theater history is the same as American history. And so they are very intertwined because theater is almost always rooted in some kind of rebellion or some kind of response to society. So it's either a response to current events and culture, a cautionary tale of past events, or poses questions about the future based on society's current path. We also hope that throughout this course, you'll understand the importance behind knowing the who, what, when, where, and why of musical theater, and how this will help you create engaging and informative and community building events and performances in your area. So we are on week 4, as I said, but we started out this course by looking at the history of musical theater intertwined with American history. Then we went into looking at the shows that defined the Golden Age. Last week, we looked at the shows that paved the way to what potentially is considered the new Golden Age of musical theater. This week, we are going to be looking at the creatives behind musical theater, since we've mostly just looked at everything from an overview standpoint. So we're going to dig into who were the people that made these things. And then next week, we are going to be looking at what comes next. So we are going to be looking at the last 10 years of Broadway and making some conjectures about exactly where we're headed and where we're going, which is even more exciting than normal, because we are in a state right now where we don't know what the future of theater is, and we actually get to be an integral part of defining what that future looks like in a way that if this COVID-19 stuff hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't be able to do at such a large scale. So just as a quick note, musical theater is a relatively new history because it is less than 100 years old in America and in the world. If we look at American musical theater history starting in 1943 with the creation of Oklahoma. I don't claim to be the expert in this history. My analysis and background is rooted in through my work as an applied theater, dramaturgy, education, and political science, with an emphasis on social discourse, which is why this is looking at the rebellious history of musical theater. I also just want to call out that I am a cis white straight female. And so that is just a bias that I have going into this work. I am working very hard to expand my knowledge and to call out the biases that I have done in my research. So as we are going through, please feel free to add any information that you know that I am skipping over, or if there are important folks in particular that you think should be mentioned in this course, please feel free to call those things out. I also do want to mention as we go into today's work, I really want to call out my bias in this way because we are going to be looking specifically at commercial theater and Broadway. And with that, the genre has been really heavily dominated by men. And so I tried to make sure that we included women as well. However, just that, I just want to call that out as before we go ahead and begin. Also, because this is looking at folks that fought against societal norms in some fashion to create theater, we are almost certainly going to skip over many of your favorite musicals, especially today. We are going to be having to skip over so many people that were really instrumental in creating this art form. And so please don't be too upset about this, and just know that I'm sure that whatever show is your favorite or whatever creative is your favorite has a wonderful spot in musical theater history, but we only have so much time. And I feel like every single one of these classes, I'm always like, what the heck? We're out of time. This is crazy. So just please note that. Great. And just as a quick reminder, everything that we do at ReTheater is rooted in the idea of making art that matters. And with this course in particular, we want you to realize the importance behind knowing who wrote this story, what the story is about, when it was written and when the story is set, where it was written and where the story takes place, why the show was written and what inspired the writer and what did they hope to gain from contributing this story to society. Once we get done with this course, I hope that you're able to understand, first of all, how to research that material and have a baseline to go off of, but also how this information can help you in creating a dramaturgical protocol or even just a simple research outline for yourself if you don't want to go too deep into the dramaturgy of everything. Great. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive into today's work, which is looking at the creatives that defined the genre of musical theater. So, as I always like to start these courses out, or these classes out, I would love to open it up to you guys to hear from you who you think is very important in this work. When you think of people that define this genre, who comes to mind? So if you want to just go ahead and unmute yourself or put it over in the chat, let's just have a quick conversation.
Stephen Sondheim.
So you're saying like, yeah, specifically musical theater?
Yes, specifically musical theater. We are not going to be looking at like theater history, so we won't be looking at like straight theater. But yeah, Mary, so Stephen Sondheim, absolutely. And if you guys want to call out why too, that's great, because I'd love to hear from you guys' point of view.
If he hadn't been a musical theater writer, he would have been a psychiatrist.
That is such a good point, Mary.
Yeah, he's got such a razor sharp take on human nature. He's so bloody honest. I wish more like preachers would watch his shows.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. Awesome. Anybody else have anybody that they think of when they think of people that help define the genre of musical theater?
Yeah, I actually, so last time I was in New York, I got to go to the library over by Lincoln Center, and I checked out the Hal Prince exhibit they have over there, and it's just really like stunning to like walk through there and just see like how many shows he had his hand in. So yeah, I would definitely put Hal Prince in that conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
I think like didn't he start from like Pajama Game all the way up to Parade? I think was one of his later shows.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
we'll go through those for sure. Yeah, yeah, he's crazy important.
Mhm.
I think that we can't, when I do this talk in class, we spend some time on George Balanchine.
Yes,
Mm.
we are not going to be talking about George Balanchine, but that's a very important person. Do you want to just like speak to that and why you believe that that's a person we can talk about?
Well, he was a ballet dancer, Russian, I believe Balanchine was, or I forget right now. But he basically was the first person to bring full ballet into a theater show with his Slaughter on 10th Avenue. And it was the first time that year, because of his choreography in that particular number, that they introduced choreography into the Tony Awards. Like, he began that genre, or that section of musical theater for musical theater.
Absolutely. And I think another thing too is, so most of us are probably familiar with his work because there's two versions of the Nutcracker, and he is the most famous one. The other person's name is clearly escaping me right now, but there's only two places in the world that perform the other version of the Nutcracker. In Seattle, now there's only, I think, one. Seattle used to be one of those places. But of course I can't remember his name. But yes, that's a really great point. And thank you for sharing that. Because yeah, he is.
And also, I'm sorry, Big Mac Swagger.
Yeah, Marianne.
I mean, total thumbs up on him. I mean, he was the choreographer for West Side Story.
Oh, that was
Jerome Robbins, yeah.
Oh, I thought Balanchine was part of that.
We'll talk about like why those two people often get like intertwined, because their work was very, very similar. In so many, because some people credit, I mean, I agree with you, Marianne, that Balanchine was like the person who defined ballet on Broadway, but Jerome Robbins, oftentimes because of West Side Story and like how prolific West Side Story was, he often gets that credit. But yes, good points.
My bad.
No, you're good. This is what the whole thing is about. And Marianne is so great and smart. And sometimes she's like, hey, Lindsay, why didn't we talk about this? And that's why I love her here. Awesome. Anybody else? Matthew, you think of no one? You're like the youngest person.
Yeah, I know. I think that's the problem. As I was going to say, I always have a thought, but not on this one. Sadly.
Not on this one.
Yep, not on this one. Yep.
All right. Great. Well, let's go ahead and then.
Can you remind me of the question? Is the question? I'm not seeing the PDF. Is the question of a specific era? I mean, time frame.
Great question, Mary. So we're actually today going to be going through all of musical theater history and just looking at. I took select folks from each category that we're going to look at.
Who's the woman? Susan something started out as a choreographer.
Mm-hmm.
And now as director.
Yeah, Susan
Stroman.
Yes. To bring up a woman who's been influential.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, well, let's go ahead and dive in. We've talked about a lot of the people that we're going to be talking about today. And as always, this one is even more true with this course or this specific class, because we're going to be going from 1943 all the way up through current times. So we will almost certainly skip over people that should be recognized. So in each category, there's between 3 and 5 folks that we're going to talk about. And also I want to call out that not every single category we are going to dive into. So my specific background comes from directing and choreography. And so we are going to focus in those areas, as well as like composers and leader assists, but we aren't going to be talking a lot about design. However, that is a course that we are looking at developing so that we can look at more specifically the design elements behind musical theater, because that is also very important. And someone brought up to me that, hey, why aren't we doing that? So just so you know, we aren't going to be able to cover literally everything. And also, I will start sharing my screen again because this is in the PowerPoint. But we also are going to just be focusing specifically on commercial theater on Broadway for the most part. There are so many game changers and pioneers and artists that like are from across the country and across time that we should call out, but because of the fact that this class is only about 90 minutes long, we can't focus on everything. So I highly encourage you, if you're the majority of your theater knowledge comes from commercial Broadway theater, I highly encourage you to start to expand that to look elsewhere. I mean, a really easy place to start is looking at theater below 14th Street in New York City. There is so much that goes on there still, or was going on there still today, but that's a really easy point to jump off of. You also could be going down and looking at theater in Georgia, specifically in Atlanta, also in New Orleans. There's really rich theater history in those areas. We are not going to be covering those today. If that is something that anybody is interested in seeing a course in the future developed on, or just even doing like a general theater history course, please let me know. You can throw that over in the comments. But yes, I just want to make sure that we understand kind of the parameters that we're putting around today. All right, so we are going to start by looking at the founding fathers of musical theater. So the last 2 weeks specifically, I really hope that we've been able to really specifically look at the idea of what makes musical theater. So last week we specifically talked about the transition from the book musical and concept musical, which, just as a quick review, the book musical is a musical where the lyrics, the dance, and the dialogue all contribute towards telling one cohesive story. A concept musical is more of a meditation on an idea or concept. We looked at how we have moved from that in the late 1970s into this idea of the mega musical, which is more about spectacle than substance and has huge sets, and we see this like entire evolution of giant effects into then the corporate and movie musical. So this idea, the corporate musical was a musical that can stand on its own and is more involved in presenting a brand than specifically telling a story that is a star power vehicle or anything like that. So things like The Lion King and the movie musicals that we see coming out really are there. And we also looked at the jukebox musical, which is a musical that is comprised of music that was not specifically written for that show. So things like Mamma Mia, All Shook Up, Jersey Boys, these are all examples of jukebox musicals. So we really spent some time looking at this whole transition throughout musical theater history. And today let's start looking at the people that actually created it. And so these 5 folks I like to call the founding fathers of musical theater. I want to also mention, this is always really hard to narrow down because some of these folks are highly problematic in a lot of different ways. And we can dive into that a little bit today, although we won't focus on that specifically a ton. That would be a whole other class we could teach, is the problematic nature of musical theater. But yeah, so these are the 5 folks that based on what we're going to be looking at today, I would say really did found this magical art form that we all love. So obviously starting Rodgers and Hammerstein, and then you also have to add Agnes de Mille in there as well. They created what is known as the book musical today with Oklahoma. One thing I think that we oftentimes overlook with Rodgers and Hammerstein, because it is such a nostalgic art form, is actually looking into how passionate Oscar Hammerstein was about creating work that was reflective of society, but oftentimes doing it in a way that was removed enough so that the audience could enter into the story and be called out for their bias without necessarily having it reflected directly back at them. That is something that I feel very passionately about as an artist. I really like that art theater has the ability to allow people to question their reality and to question their ideas and their morals without necessarily holding up the mirror directly in their face and being like, hi, you're a racist. Hi, you're a misogynist. Oh, you're a terrible person. We can do that. A lot of theater does that. But Rodgers and Hammerstein kind of were masters and really, I think, set the tone and paved the way for this to be the thing that musical theater could do in a really non-intrusive way. So Rodgers and Hammerstein, even beginning back in with Carousel, like actually portraying violence and domestic abuse on stage, while they probably didn't do it great, since, you know, they said that sometimes when someone hits you, it feels like a kiss. Nope, it doesn't. However, they were showing this darker side of humanity in a way that allowed audiences to really kind of look at the way our society works and how we demonize people, or how we just turn a blind eye to people's bad intentions or malintent. We talked about this a little bit last week or 2 weeks ago with South Pacific. South Pacific is another really important musical in Rodgers and Hammerstein's repertoire because of the fact that it was written only 4 years after World War II ended, but also how it looked at race and race on stage and race relations. And it really called people out. The South wouldn't even allow it to be performed. Rodgers and Hammerstein refused to let it be performed in segregated theaters. And Hammerstein was really the driving force behind this. Rodgers wasn't as passionate about it, which is why later in their career, the closer that we get to Sound of Music, the less we see these political statements being made through their work. Hammerstein was extremely sick during Sound of Music, and so he did not really write most of the music for that. His last song he ever wrote while he was alive was Edelweiss, which, I mean, is like very beautiful to think of as like a final song someone would write. But Rodgers and another partner wrote a lot of Sound of Music. And we really see at that point, Rodgers and Hammerstein's style of musical theater is really on the outs, because we are starting to come into this new idea of the concept musical and what the stories that we're telling on stage as we get into the 1960s. However, their impact cannot be diminished at all as we go through how this musical theater was founded. There's a really fantastic documentary that you can watch called Out of My Dreams, and it's all about Oscar Hammerstein. I find it interesting, and I was not sure if young people would find it interesting. I think it's a six-part series. I showed it in a not a school classroom, like in an extracurricular theater classroom, and my students actually really enjoyed it. And it was a way that really got them to see Rodgers and Hammerstein in a different light and to see how impactful they were, and not just as like old dusty men sitting up on the shelf. Rodgers and Hammerstein obviously are pretty problematic in a lot of ways, but we also do need to credit them with the idea of being progressive for their time period. It doesn't take away from the other issues, but it's an important thing to consider. Next is Stephen Sondheim, which is great because Stephen Sondheim was actually the mentee of Oscar Hammerstein. Stephen Sondheim grew up without a father, and Oscar Hammerstein lived down the road and kind of took him under his wing and helped mentor him into the theater. Oscar Hammerstein was the one that encouraged Stephen Sondheim to get into writing. He was the one that encouraged Stephen Sondheim not to be discouraged and after West Side Story and to do Gypsy, even though Stephen Sondheim really wanted to be a lyricist and composer. And so it's a beautiful, like, wonderful mentorship that we continue to see today with other composers mentoring younger composers. And Stephen Sondheim, because of his relationship with Oscar Hammerstein, is extremely passionate about mentoring younger generations and about education and passing down the craft. And so when we think about it, Oscar Hammerstein really created the book musical, but Stephen Sondheim created the concept musical, and they could not be more different in so many ways. Stephen Sondheim, if you haven't watched any of the several documentaries that are made about him, highly recommend it, or read any of his books. Stephen Sondheim is besides being an amazing composer, he also is just such a solid voice of reason within our industry. He will not critique or say things negative about any person that is still alive, but still is able to like really critique this work, our body of work, in a way that's like he doesn't sound like a jerk when he does it, but he also isn't like flowery. So like even when he talks about Hammerstein's and Rodgers and Hammerstein's work, he oftentimes is like, It's so flowery, it's so poetic, it doesn't actually say the things that it's meaning to say. And you can see, if you look at his work and how it was influenced by Hammerstein, West Side Story, he just wrote the lyrics for West Side Story. West Side Story, it's so flowery. And there's a great interview where he talks about, he's like, the only line that really sounds like any teenager would say is in something, something's coming, when he talks about like catching a baseball in a mitt. He's like, that is something that a teenager would say. They would not be comparing, like, they wouldn't be outside some girl's house, like singing all these metaphors about a girl named Maria. They wouldn't be like, they would not be using the language that they at their age. And so Stephen Sondheim moved away from that, and you can see it, the language he uses, while extremely intelligent and very I mean, he's a great wordsmith and poet, but it is pretty colloquial. So like it's easily accessible. It oftentimes seems much harder than it is because of the rate that he's speaking at, or he writes at, and the way that the rhymes intertwine. I did a good friend of mine, and I did a podcast that unfortunately didn't get to air, about Stephen Sondheim, but we're going to re-record it. And he talks a lot about how Stephen Sondheim is super similar to Shakespeare, which, if you're ever trying to find ways to teach Shakespeare to your students, is a really interesting way to have them compare and contrast. Lin-Manuel Miranda, in a lot of ways, also has a lot in common with Shakespeare, which is interesting because Stephen Sondheim is a huge influencer on Lin-Manuel Miranda's career. But let's talk about him in a minute. So yeah, so Stephen Sondheim, he really redefined the genre in every single way, from the stories that we tell on stage, from the point of view that these stories are told, from the way that music is used as a device to tell the stories. And he continues today to have his work produced. And something I think is really admirable about him is so many creators get so stuck on everything being done the way that they originally intended it to be done. You can look at so many, like Arthur Miller's estate, so many people will not allow their work to be done with different genders, with different like circumstances around the story. And Stephen Sondheim actually is really encouraging of that. And you see this last season, before we had to stop both Company and West Side Story on stage, done in completely reimagined ideas, and he celebrated both of them. So next along the line would be Hal Prince, which Sean mentioned a few minutes ago. Hal Prince really is the definitive director of musical theater, and really a great bridge, in my opinion, between the more traditional like theater approach that was developed by Lee Strasberg and the group theater, and bringing that onto the stage. Much of his work is deeply grounded in humanity. And I think that with the trend of musical theater becoming so over the top and like so musical theater, if you know what I mean, just like everything big and not very grounded, Hal Prince really shows that grounded humanity really has the ability to speak to audiences, since he holds 21 Tony Awards between being a director and a producer. That's the most of any individual. His ability to see what kind of stories would work and to nurture and foster these stories onto the stage is unlike anyone else. He started his career started off pretty slow, and he got pretty discouraged until Cabaret. He almost didn't do Cabaret, but when he finally was convinced to do Cabaret, when he looked at what's happening in American society and how divided we were as a country, and wanted to produce Cabaret so that America would be reminded of the hardships or what happened in Germany, so that we would use that as a template to avoid that kind of thing in America. So he was highly influential. He went on to do so much work. I think his last, I'm looking at it right now, it looks like, yeah, his last show that he was heavily involved in was a show on the West End. But yeah, you can go and look into Hal Prince. Whoa, what did I just do? Into his work. And you can see his influence across the genre. Next would be Bob Fosse. Bob Fosse was a really problematic human. However, it's impossible to talk about Broadway without talking about Bob Fosse and the way that he really deeply influenced this genre. Bob Fosse came around at the same time as Jerome Robbins. Jerome Robbins, we'll talk about in a moment. He was in theater and was very much, as Marianne mentioned, Balanchine and then Jerome Robbins had a lot of roots in ballet. Agnes de Mille did as well, although she was more modern. Bob Fosse came along and totally redefined, the dance world in so many ways, but also Broadway choreography. He came out with these really angular and isolated movements that were used to tell a story in really interesting, unique ways. He also fought directly against the idea of having showgirls and having women displayed just as like beautiful sexual objects. He definitely still objectified women, but not necessarily in that traditional chorus girl way. He also was really a genius in the way that he was able to take shows and bring out the darkness of humanity, which is something that I think is really important. So when we think about a lot of his work nowadays, when we think of Chicago, we don't think of Chicago being highly controversial in the content that it's being spoken about or that it's speaking about. Instead, we think of like, oh, it's controversial because there are women running around in lingerie. But when Bob Fosse worked on that show, it was a whole like commentary on the American criminal justice system and on fame. And in Razzle Dazzle, his original choreography and the original staging of that moment was going to be people simulating sex on stage to show how the criminal justice system really like was basically screwing people and blinding them with the justice that they said they were serving. That didn't happen. It was too abstract, and the producers were like, yeah, no, you're not doing that. But he was able to bring out this darkness through his work with Chicago. Pippin especially is like his iconic, one of his iconic pieces from a exploration of humanity. Sweet Charity, we also think of like the Anne Applegate version of that, and it's so different if we look at his work, even though that was one of his last pieces in the 80s. So finally, Joe Papp we have to talk about, he was brought up 2 weeks ago. Joe Papp was a hugely influential person with the Public Theater. The Public Theater is a huge like institution that is so very important to American theater and also to American musical theater. Joe Papp really was passionate about developing new work that was happening not on Broadway. So before Joe Papp came along in the 60s, musicals did not have to go through a development period like we know of it today. If you had a famous name, if you had success, or if you had backing, you could just put your show up. Now the whole system of doing readings, of doing development, doing workshops off Broadway, then going to Broadway, Joe Papp really created that. And he did this through Hair. Hair was was fostered and nurtured by Joe Papp. And it was the first show that went through this more traditional development process, although very much not, because Hair was a whole wild and crazy experiment of how we create theater. But he was the one that created this idea. He also went on, the Public Theater has the other two big musicals that have come from the public, while there is so many that we'll just quickly mention, is A Chorus Line and also Hamilton, both of which were extremely genre defying at the time and were a pretty big risk. Who knew that people would want to hear from performers that were in the ensemble of musicals, and that could be an entire show that was created by interviews of actual ensemble members. And who thought that we could have a musical that was a rap musical about the founding fathers? Joe Papp and the Public Theater are really invested in creating and fostering new work. That is like the biggest thing that they do there. And the other thing that I think Joe Papp, I think is really, really important that we talk about is the idea of community engagement through the arts and equity through the arts. So the Public Theater has so many endless programs that have come from the beginning with him, that bring art into communities that are underserved and find ways to bring more audiences to the theater. So things like the free Shakespeare in the Park series, I mean, even now what we know as the Public Works was not just started by Joe Papp. However, it is deeply inspired by his commitment to bring theater to the masses and to break down the elitist barriers around so much of what we see. So this idea that he created, that this development idea that anybody could get to Broadway without necessarily having that financial backing, and also bringing theater to the masses, makes him definitely a founding father of musical theater. And I saw the chat going, so I'm going to pause here for one moment and see what was going on over there. Okay, great. Oh, I hate this chat thing. Oh, I see what you're saying, Sean. Yeah, I see what you're, so Sean said Sondheim could have been a little nicer in the open letter about Porgy and Bess revival, that in Susan Laurie Parks wrote the book of. Yeah, he probably could have. I also saw that production, and I'm not gonna like dig into that too much. I've in a lot of ways agreed with his analysis, but it was still, I'm glad I saw it. But yeah, for the most part, Stephen Sondheim is pretty silent as far as like his opinions while people are still around, which is a good thing. And then there were some comments. Oh, so if you're watching in replay, you can go over into the comments. There was some questions about where to find some more documentaries. Does anybody have any questions about those 5 folks before we go on, or any additional thoughts you want to add? Wonderful. Let's continue.
Real
guess
quick.
the main thing-
Oh, great. Continue your thoughts. Yes, Mary, what did you say?
The main thing I would, I kudos towards is the idea of breaking down the barrier. I mean, the whole idea that so few people are actually going to see a Broadway show because it's just too bloody expensive. And so why does such an amazing art form have to be, you know, the money is such a big thing. So I'm not real familiar with the public theater, and I'm curious to dig into that more after this.
Absolutely.
For that very reason.
Theater is amazing in so many ways. There's obviously issues with every institution, but they're incredible, and I highly recommend like looking into their summer Shakespeare in the Park. There's actually Meryl Streep. I just saw somebody just reshared the documentary that they did around her, but they talk a lot about her work there. Yeah, check it out, and check out her.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I was also going to recommend. There's a really good PBS documentary about Raul Julia, who did a ton of stuff in Shakespeare in the Park and was a good friend of Joe Papp. So definitely check that one out. But what I love about what the public does today is like what you were saying, they take what Joe is trying to do and just like basically adapt it to the times. Because I mean, back when Joe started Shakespeare in the Park, you could just like walk up and just get a ticket and everything. But like now, like when you're having like John Lithgow play King Lear, like you're waiting hours in line for these tickets, which is why people started the mobile unit, which was like, we're going to go around to all these places there where people can't wait for 8 hours to go see these things. So we're going to bring Shakespeare to you. So, I mean, Public Works is a perfect example, because it's just like, well, not just let's bring the community in the audience, let's bring them on the stage too. So yeah.
It's a really
I love the public so much.
I know, yeah. It's a really incredible institution. So yeah, I think that I hope that we find a way to make sure that the funding gets there, because their programming already has lost $20 million with the shutdown. So
I know, but Hamilton is the treasure trove that's always refilling.
yes, so hopefully that happens. But yeah, anybody else have any thoughts? Great, let's keep going. Okay. Share. Okay, great. Go. Okay, Great. So let's look at a few more composers and lyricists that I think are really important for us to just have a knowledge of. First is Andrew Lloyd Webber. I've made it pretty clear. Andrew Lloyd Webber is not my favorite composer and lyricist. Well, in person in theater history. In a lot of ways, I think that him and Stephen Sondheim are antithesis, and you're kind of like a fan of one more than the other. They have gone head to head throughout history in this art form, and has been a kind of a test of like which person has more merit. Andrew Lloyd Webber, though, has done a lot, and I'm very impressed with the work that he currently is doing during COVID-19 to make sure that there are streaming opportunities for people to watch his work that probably have never been able to afford to go to it before. Andrew Lloyd Webber is the pinnacle idea behind the British mega musical. He brought that to life. If you're ever like looking for some like fun, hilarious internet holes to go down, go ahead and look at what Patti LuPone has to say about Andrew Lloyd Webber, because wow, it is wild and fascinating. And so yeah, Andrew Lloyd Webber is pretty old school in the way that he has created art, but we really would be remiss to not mention him because he has really paved the way for so many musicals, especially coming over from the West End. Without him, shows like Billy Elliot and Matilda probably wouldn't be here today because he really led the way for that. Also, he's not a composer, but Andrew Lloyd Webber can't be spoken about without Cameron Mackintosh. We talked about them last week. But for those of you that weren't here, Cameron Mackintosh was the mastermind behind producing Andrew Lloyd Webber's work and so much West End work that we still see today. And so really the two of them defined this genre in the idea of the mega musical, which Mary, you just mentioned, the idea of like, why is theater like elitist and why can't we afford to go to it? A lot of that has to do with what Andrew Lloyd Webber and Cameron Mackintosh did to redefine the genre into this spectacle over substance, and to have these massive budgets that were needed to produce this work. So ticket prices had to rise in order to pay for these massive budgets. Next would be Lin-Manuel Miranda. I'm pretty sure almost all of us, I hope all of us listening, are familiar with him. Lin-Manuel Miranda is really, I would say, the father of the new musical. He is doing so much, not just on stage, but off stage, to ensure that musical theater continues to live on, but not that it just lives on in its original form, that we continue to adapt and find ways to make theater equitable and also reflect our times. He's pretty ingenious in the way that he does all of his work. If you look at his repertoire, yeah, there are some things on there that are probably like Bring It On. Maybe you're going to say, I don't know about that. But both In the Heights and Hamilton are absolutely incredible works that he's created. And both have been so defining in this genre, especially, In the Heights was this little tiny show that started downtown that ended up coming to Broadway and winning the Tony, that was about Washington Heights, which who would go see a musical about a predominantly Latino community and seeing how that was being gentrified and changed. He was able to find the heart and to find the way to tell that story in a way that invited all audience members in. He went on to do translations for not the current revival of West Side Story, but the previous one. And he also has done so much to help foster the arts outside of the theater that they perform within. So when the Drama Bookshop lost their lease because it became too expensive, him and several other players from Hamilton, they ended up taking over the Drama Bookshop. It was supposed to open at the end of March. In New York City, however, it was not able to because of COVID-19, but it will be opening, and he's keeping his Drama Bookshop alive. If you don't know the Drama Bookshop, it's kind of like, it's a huge staple in the theater world. It used to be this magical little like bookstore that you would go to and you could find like the most obscure, amazing theater, both texts and scripts. I would always spend an entire day at the drama bookshop before I moved to New York, because there was so much wonderful things to find. Plus, they also fostered readings and developments in the basement, and that's actually where In the Heights started, with Kerry Washington as Nina, which is a crazy thought to think of. And so, yeah, so he has done so much. The other thing that is important to know with him is they have taken the Ham Ed, or Ed Ham, however they go together, the idea of where they were bringing in school students to see Hamilton, encouraging them to create their own work. They have brought that online, and it is open to anyone. So anybody can sign up. You get lesson plans for at home, and you get ideas of how to create art, and you get to submit them. And a certain number of them will be able to like be featured. And so he just does a lot to encourage young people to continue to create art and bring joy to people's lives. Janine Tesori is such an important person that is so often overlooked because we don't even realize how much work she has created. But Janine Tesori is such a prolific female voice on the stage, from her work in Thoroughly Modern Millie to Fun Home. She has done so much to bring a female perspective to the stage, especially in a world that is so heavily dominated by men. You can go look up her work. She's also done things with Shrek. She has done so much. And what I love about her work in particular is you can really see a different heart and a different humanity portrayed on stage. It definitely has a very different tone that she, especially when you look at the female characters and how they are empowered in her stories. Fun Home is an absolute work of genius in so many ways. I know it's not everybody's favorite show, but the way that they were able to adapt these moments from the graphic novel and bring them to life. I mean, Ring of Keys is so instrumental in so many young people's lives, and means so much to them. She just has really found a way to bring these voices to the stage. And Violet, I know it had the 2014 revival with Sutton Foster. It's just, look up her work. She is somebody that should be more sung than she is, which is why I wanted to include her on this list of influential composers and lyricists, because she really is somebody that is super influential. Oh my gosh, the chat is going crazy. Okay, great. Great. So then next we'll talk about Kander and Ebb. Kander and Ebb have written a bazillion musicals as well. But how they are interesting, so they wrote things like Cabaret, the Scottsboro Boys. They were partners for over 50 years. Ebb died in I believe it was 2004 as he was writing Curtains, the musical, not with Kander, but they have written so many things together. But what was really interesting is that the way that they portrayed politics and gender on stage. Oh, sorry, there's an error there. With their work with Cabaret, they do not shy away from using their own voice and putting that onto the stage. Many folks try to find a neutral voice and to find a way that panders to audiences. That is absolutely not what Kander and Ebb did, especially, and if you look at how incredibly like poignant their work was, especially in the time periods that it was written, they really paved the way and put themselves out there for able to be criticized. So they really have like made it possible for so many playwrights to use politics on stage, and especially in musical theater. Finally, we'll talk a little about Kander and Ebb did write Curtains together, Sean? I thought that Ebb was writing that with somebody else. They wrote Scottsboro Boys together for sure. So do you want to check?
No, they wrote Curtains together too. I think, no, because I mean, I saw Curtains, but also like if you watch David Hyde Pierce's acceptance speech for when he won Best Actor, he thanks Kander and Ebb together.
Let's pause.
But yes, I'm almost positive that they wrote that. That was like the last show they wrote together.
Oh, okay, so it was predominantly, so it was originally being written by, okay, yes, you're correct, by Ebb, but then after he passed, Kander and Holmes wrote the remaining music, the lyrics. Great, thank you for that clarification. I don't know why I had that mixed up, but I appreciate that very, very much. Thank you. So yes, okay, great. So Kander was writing the music, yes, and Rupert Holmes is doing the book. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Marianne, for that too. Great. Okay, cool. So the last composers and lyricists that we're going to chat about are Jason Robert Brown and Andrew Lippa. Both have really helped define the off-Broadway genre of musical theater. We aren't going to spend too much time talking about them, but both have had success on Broadway, but probably their most influential work has been off-Broadway, and that is where we see the majority of their influence. So Jason Robert Brown with his song cycle, Songs for a New World, as well as The Last 5 Years, have gone on to be very influential pieces of music, or of art. A Parade was a really daring story that he chose to tell and bring it to the stage. It does not get nearly the recognition it deserves, but it's also an incredibly heavy and hard story to sit through. And like many musicals that don't end happy, that is one that really does not. So, so both, and then with Andrew Lippa, with his work, probably his most famous work that most people talk about would be The Wild Party. The Wild Party never made it to Broadway, but launched the careers of so many people. So, like, I mean, Idina Menzel and Taye Diggs had definitely had their careers with Rent, started there, but The Wild Party really helped show that, okay, these folks actually can be more than just these original characters that they created. And The Wild Party is wildly, that was a great pun, but it wasn't intended to be, but it's really wildly influential in the stories that we tell, and the way that character and design and can all work together in a really unique way to tell the story. So I like to put both of these folks here just from a standpoint of unique storytelling and defining off-Broadway. Unfortunately, this year we had a huge off-Broadway musical lineup. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see a lot of those shows, but a lot of that we can contribute to these two, as well as Janine Tesori in a lot of ways, in giving the off-Broadway musical legs and lasting impact in our culture. Oy vey. Da. Okay, great. So we'll quickly just chat a little bit about some of the influential book writers. Terrence McNally, who unfortunately has recently passed away, was wildly important in both musical theater history, but also theater history. Terrence McNally wrote so many plays that we will continue to produce for years to come, as well as wrote the book for both Ragtime and Ragtime and Anastasia. There's so many, the list goes on and on that he wrote, but what he did, and that I think is why we need to put him on this list, is he redefined in a way the book musical that we really have needed and has set the gold standard for book musicals, especially in the modern era, because today with our transition into more movie and jukebox musicals, it's really easy to just kind of like brush that aside and to make that not as important because we're just waiting for those big song numbers. But he really showed how, when a book is really solid, how a musical can truly work. He also did not shy away from complex work as well. I mean, he did Kiss of the Spider Woman, which is an incredibly complex piece of theater that's not frequently done because of its complexity, but he was able to use the book in a way that so many book writers aren't able to today, to actually tell the story and not just be a bridge between one song to the next. James Lapine has worked with like every single composer that has gone to make mega musicals. He has worked with both Andrew Lloyd Webber and Stephen Sondheim, both of them on what I would argue are their strongest pieces from a book standpoint. James Lapine wrote the book for Into the Woods, which is, I think, a work of genius in so many ways because it so seamlessly intertwines these characters while also like giving us a lot of character development through the text that we don't normally see in musical theater, because the character development mostly comes through the songs, but they're able to bridge the gaps in a way that's fascinating because Into the Woods is so heavily told through song that they seamlessly go in and out. And so James Lapine has like worked with pretty much everyone. He also worked on the falsettos, and which the falsettos obviously is very important in musical theater history, because I mean it's the first time that we see the AIDS epidemic talked about on stage. But yes, so James Lapine is very important, and you can go, he's like written a bazillion books in the universe. So go check more about him. I highly recommend it. And then finally, Harvey Fierstein, who both is a book writer, but also a performer. He was a part of the team for La Cage aux Folles. He also was a part of, he wrote Torch Song. There's so much work that he has done, and what his work has really, he's really talented at bringing camp to stage in a way that's like accessible to many audience members, but also the way that he talks about sexuality and the way that the characters explore that through his work are all very important reasons that he needs to be listed as an important book writer, who especially was rebellious in the way that he told stories. Okay. Someday I will figure out how to make this work. Okay, great. Wonderful. So next we are going to chat a little bit about the director choreographers that have defined musical theater. So the director choreographer has always been a part of musical theater, well, has been for a very long time. Many of the great works that we think of with musical theater, they are a director choreographer at the helm. And so let's just talk about a few of these people who were really important in defining and contributed a lot to musical theater. Excuse me. Michael Bennett is, I think, the most important person on this list, probably because I'm biased, but Michael Bennett really was able to bring musical theater to a standstill with his work with Chorus Line. Because a chorus line, we've talked about it several times now, but a chorus line really, unlike anything we've ever seen, I believe that Michael Bennett was a true artist, not just a choreographer, not just a director. He obviously was a dancer, but the way that he created his work really brought a voice and a soul to the stage that we don't often get to see. The vulnerability that he was able to portray both through his direction and his choreography is incredible. He obviously, Chorus Line is known for his big dance numbers. None of his dance numbers, though, the original choreography, it's all very character driven. And we get to see so much about these characters through that work. And so unfortunately, a chorus line really did go on to live into history and has had so much success. But as far as director choreographers go, Michael Bennett is definitely at the top of that list as far as development and creation of work and direction. So yeah. Gary Champion is one of the first director choreographers that we need to remember. He really defined classic Broadway. He did so many shows. His last one, we talked a little bit about it last week, was 42nd Street, but so many, like, he really was the golden age classic musical theater. He was the one of the definers of that era. When we Bye Bye Birdie, he did Bye Bye Birdie, Hello Dolly, these, and they all have a very signature style to them that now we kind of erase, because when we think of golden age, all lump it into like one category and one style. But Gower Champion is the person that we can really thank for that creation of that style of musical theater. Jerome Robbins, we spoke quite a bit about already, but Jerome Robbins, he started out as a choreographer. He also was like Balanchine, and he teetered between the ballet world and the musical theater world. Obviously, West Side Story is one of his like biggest hits, and really, really influential. He also was heavily influential in a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. He even though he is not credited for that work, and also was the director and choreographer behind Fiddler. A lot of his work is still done with his original choreography. If you haven't ever worked on one of his shows, I know for sure West Side Story and Fiddler, you are able to get his choreography notes to recreate that work, and it is fascinating to read his notes within that. He was extremely fastidious in his work. A lot of people confuse Jerome Robbins, Balanchine, and Fosse. There's no reason we should be confusing Jerome Robbins with Fosse, other than that they were working at the same time and both like redefining what musical theater dance was. But yeah, Jerome Robbins is extremely influential. I would say that he probably, I mean, without his work that was extremely physical, Jerry Mitchell, who's the next person on the list, probably we would not be seeing the musicals that we see today that Jerry Mitchell has done. So let's go ahead and just chat about him. So Jerry Mitchell is a new director choreographer. He's done things like Kinky Boots, The Revival of La Cage aux Folles. He did Legally Blonde, which is one of my favorite musicals, absolutely. And he's done a lot of work out in Las Vegas. His work is extremely athletic. It's extremely powerful in the way that he works with dancers. But also what he's been able to do is he's been able to bring so much of the drag and LGBTQ culture onto stage in a way that shows the power and importance behind these characters without putting them into a box and showing them how, like, in a stereotypical way. Jerry Mitchell is he will continue to make work for a long time to come. But so much of the resurgence of this big, like the big, powerful, like jazz hands type of music. I mean, Casey Nicolai is like, is so similar to Jerry Mitchell in so many ways. But Jerry Mitchell is just like the pioneer in getting that style of musical theater back onto the stage. Similarly, Susan Stroman is a director choreographer. She is still currently working. She also and mostly all these people began either as performers or as choreographers and then transitioned into being director choreographers. Susan Stroman, she kind of like made a lot of waves as far as the director choreographer work that she did with Contact, which is a 3-part dance story. It is not necessarily a musical. People kind of lost their minds when Contact won Best Musical because they're like, this is not a musical. What is this? But she's probably best known for her work both with the producers and with Big Fish, because both were so revolutionary in so many ways, in the way that that these stories were told. And she's not as often, like, her phrases are not sung as often as so many others, which is truly unfortunate, because her work is so solidly rooted in musical theater and in the traditional form. However, she has been able to find ways that continue to like push the art form in different ways. I mean, with the producers, that was when we saw the resurgence of the musical comedy, and she was able to do so much with that in her career. She's always creating new, interesting work. We just don't hear about it as much. So if you would like to know more about her, I highly recommend checking out her work. She speaks a lot, so you can find a lot of her work talked about on YouTube and all over the place as well. Oh my gosh, seriously. Go to the next slide. Wonderful. Okay, so Speaking as female directors, we're going to talk about directors that have been important to the art form. We've talked a lot about the directors already that were men and that helped define the art form coming up to the current time period, but I wanted to make sure that we focused on some really important pioneering female directors, and not just because they're female, we're going to talk about them, but because I truly believe that these women or these humans are redefining so much of musical theater and what we see today. So Diane Paulus, she's a powerhouse in so many ways, but what she has done in a really unique way as she kind of began the re-examining of classic musical theater. And how can we bring these stories to the stage today, and in a really unique way. So she started deconstructing her work. She did Hair. She's doing the new, she's involved with a new revival of 1776 that was just announced. But right now, when we see on Broadway is this deconstruction of musical theater. It's not just a revival because of a revival. But so she really was the one that brought this to the forefront and also has made it into the popularity that it is today. Julie Taymor, with her work both on Spider-Man and which was not a success, and just was like a giant money pit, but also her work with Lion King. I believe that she is like the creator of the new mega musical. Both Diane Paulus and Julie Taymor do like immersive, crazy, like experimental theater as well as doing musical theater. And Julie Taymor has, with The Lion King, really helped solidify like, oh yeah, mega musicals can also come from America. And they don't need to just be a copy of what we're seeing on the West End. I also love about her is that she's a designer as well. Anytime we can see women both being in a role of, anybody being in the role of a director as well as a designer, it's always interesting to see those places overlap. Rachel Chavkin, you can go. She just did a talk with the New York Theater Workshop like 2 weeks ago. So she's still creating work, obviously. So we're not going to talk a ton about her because I think that just go listen to her speak about how she enters into stories. And it's so fascinating and interesting. Her work with Great Comet and Hadestown is so definitive of the direction that we are going to be going with musical theater in the way that stories are told and the perspective that they're being told. She's pretty new in her career, so I cannot wait to see where we continue to go with her work. She is able to deconstruct stories, and especially like really massive epics. So with both Great Comet and Hadestown, and also her work with Moby Dick, those are like massive stories, and she's able to distill them and find the humanity, and her work is really fascinating. And then finally, Sammy Knold, who is probably my favorite female director, and she's like I think 25 or 26, so it's crazy, but Sammy Knold is really defining the future. So she was mentored by Diane Paulus and also was associate on Hadestown. But Sammy is doing work that is looking at from a female perspective at these classics. So she did an immersive production of Ragtime on Ellis Island. She also just she directed the recent Encores performance of Evita. There is a wonderful TED Talk that she did about Evita that I encourage all of you to go and watch, because she talks a lot about how in Evita she did a ton of research, but she thought it was really important that Evita, when she was younger, was played not by the woman who would play her the entire time, but by a younger actress, so that we could actually see the fact that Evita was so young. Like, she was not this like woman who, like how she often is portrayed as like kind of like this sexual powerhouse. Like, instead we look at how she was manipulated by men and she was able to play that but then you get to ask the question as an audience member, was she actually in charge, or was she not? And so her work is wonderful. She just directed Endlings. Unfortunately, that was cut short, but that was down at New York Theater Workshop, I also believe. Somebody can correct me if that's not true. But her work, she is up and coming, and I totally recommend and encourage you to go and see her idea. Yes, thank you, Mary. Yeah, that is, Mary put it over in the chat, the name of that TED Talk. Okay, what time is it? Oh, great, we're doing okay. Well, I'm just gonna run through these guys really quickly. Man, we always run out of time. Okay, so female performers, we're gonna go through these very quick. These are all really important people. You should check them out more because their stuff is really awesome. But Chita Rivera, she was the first Latino woman to win the Kennedy Center honor. She created so many classic roles. She did both Rosie in Bye Bye Birdie, as well as Anita in West Side Story. Her work and her just as a human and what she stood for is really interesting. And I highly recommend, if you are not familiar with her work, to go check that out. Gwen Verdon is definitely the unsung hero behind so much of the golden age of musical theater. And so she was married to Bob Fosse for a while, but they continued to remain collaborators throughout his and her career. She is uncredited with so much work. She also was one of Bob Fosse's muses and brought a lot of the classic dances that we associate with him to life. Patti LuPone has to be on the important list of female performers. Mostly, I mean, she has created so many iconic female roles, from everything from Evita to her work in Sunset Boulevard, which she was fired from, and now currently in Company. She's a true powerhouse, and she is able to bring her own unique spin to everything that she creates. I mean, with her work and what she did in Sweeney Todd and that revival was entirely different than the work that Angela Lansbury did in the original. She also is outspoken. And as I mentioned when we talked about Andrew Lloyd Webber, how it's a fun little jaunt on the internet you can take to look at what her feelings on him. She is outspoken, and she is never afraid to speak her mind. She also is right now like doing hilarious videos from her basement during quarantine and like bringing immense amounts of joy. Her memoir is a trip. It's both informational and makes you feel like, wow, that's insane. As well as there's a great article that recently came out. I'll find it at the end and put it in the chat, where she talks about all of her feelings about the current situation and where Broadway is going, and like actually pauses in the middle of the interview to go text someone to see if producers have to pay their rent, and if they don't, why they're not paying people for their work. So that's fun. Lea Salonga, all of us have, if you don't know her name, and most of us have seen Aladdin, I assume. She is the singing voice of Jasmine, but she was the first Asian woman to win a Tony Award, but has gone on to be a huge influence in Broadway, both because she is amazing and has been able to portray many amazing Asian roles, but also because she is able to she's often cast in roles that are not traditionally cast by women, or excuse me, cast by Asian women. And so her role as Eponine, her work in Les Mis, she's cross-genre, and she's extremely influential when we look at female performers and their impact both on and off stage. Audra McDonnell, she, besides being absolutely incredible, has won the most Tony Awards of any single person, any performer, which is 8 Tony Awards. And she is also 6 Tony Awards, and she is also the only person to have won in all 4 categories. So both supporting and lead performance by a female in both the musicals and in a play. She is frequently working on Broadway. I believe her last work that she was working on was Johnny Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune. And she's done several articles about that. Anybody who's interested in intimacy directing and the portrayal of women on stage through that work, I believe it's in the New York Times, but she does a really wonderful article talking about that work. If you're not familiar with Frankie and Johnny, it's not a musical, so we're not going to talk about it here. But go check it out, that article, because the opening scene is very iconic and very interesting when you apply intimacy directing to it. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. Finally, we're going to go ahead and talk about the male performers very quickly because I want to make sure we get to questions. So Burt Williams was a Black American, and we talked about him in the first class a little bit when we were talking about Ziegfeld Follies. But he he transferred over from vaudeville. He was the first Black man that was on stage and part of a white review. He had to have his own entrance. He had to have his dressing room away from any other white performers. He constantly faced racism, and even when he performed, he had to perform in blackface and in the minstrel style. But at the same time, he was able to make so much progress in starting to get these the Black perspective on stage. Without him, something like Showboat in the mid 1920s probably wouldn't have been able to happen, because he was the first person to pave the way for integration on stage, even though he basically was just one tiny step in that direction compared to where we are today. Joel Grey has been a huge advocate both for the art form of musical theater on and off stage, but has gone on to create so many roles that we associate with today. So his work in Cabaret, he played the MC multiple times, just as at the bottom Alan Cummings has done as well. And he also was in Wicked, but he continues to perform even though he is in his 80s. Unless he just recently turned in his 90s, that could be possible as well. But he's also a big advocate and has seen so much of musical theater history that he's extremely influential in this community. Mandy Patinkin, besides just being an incredible actor who we've probably all seen and know from being Inigo Montoya in Princess Bride, he has gone on to define some of the most iconic male roles and has brought humanity to some of the most inhumane roles that we see on this stage in a lot of ways. So he was able to bring empathy and humanity to both George Seurat in Sundays in the Park with George and also Che Guevara in Evita. Probably would not be playing Che Guevara anymore, but he was able to do that. There also was recently a large scandal around Mandy Patinkin and The Great Comet. You can go read about that, but the way that he handled it was pretty gracefully, even though the situation was extremely fraught. And he's just really a beacon of light in the community, and just as a performer, he's extremely professional. So yes. Oh yeah, Sean, thank you. I was like, God, there's something else about Joel Grey. Yeah, he directed the Yiddish version of Fiddler. Great. And then finally, Alan Cummings is a huge, huge activist and advocate for the arts, and as a performer has just really found ways to bring himself onto the stage. I encourage you, if you are not familiar with Alan Cummings, please go look up his work. We're running out of time, otherwise we would go more deeply into that. But yes, Alan Cummings is a hugely important and influential performer for Broadway. Okay. And then, okay, so now we've looked a little bit at the people that have helped define and create what we know of for Broadway today. Now, next week, I'm very excited because we are going to be able to look more at what is coming next. So now that we have a baseline altogether of understanding what musical theater is and where it came from, we get to make some conjectures about where we are going to be going next. So for next week, it's going to be not very much. It's not going to be a very long presentation that we're going to talk about, but I would love for all of you guys to come because it's going to be more of a discussion because we all get to be a part of this story and of the creation of what happens next. So knowing the people and the stories and the characters that have defined this work and how American history plays into it, we can talk about what we're doing after all this stuff and we can finally go back to the theater again. We're almost out of time, so I would love to open it up for questions. Before we do that, for anybody that has to log off quickly, just a little bit, we have a couple, if you are looking for more information with ReTheater, we are finishing up our 30-day musical theater listening challenge, which you can find out more about on at our website. For educators, we are doing brainstorming teaching theater online. This month, we are announcing next month's brainstorming sessions. They meet every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central time. And we also are opening up our curated community for educators, which is called Spotlight. So if you are looking for support and looking for like-minded teachers who are trying to find ways to inspire their students during this time, we are opening that up on a pay-what-you-can basis through the end of June. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about that. For any students watching, we are doing pay-what-you-can private lessons. And then finally, here is some more contact information if you're interested in following ReTheater. There's our Instagram and Facebook handles. My Twitter, I need to take it off of here. It's there. There's our website, just retheaterco.com. You can find out more about our classes and offerings. We also have a podcast called Flipping the Script. We have a new episode coming out tomorrow, all about pedagogy of the oppressed and Meisner. And we interview Cynthia Henderson, who is a professor at Ithaca College, who is an amazing pioneer in how we can use these methods all together, and it's super inspirational and wonderful. And then I've also recently, I need to add to this, have announced there's another podcast that ReTheater is going to be a part of called The Theater District. We are partnering with the official podcast of Six the Musical, the guy who created that, Josh Mitchell, and it's going to be looking at musical theater, both through the fandom lens and through the historical lens. I can imagine you can guess which one I'm doing of those two. And so that's going to be debuting next month. We would love for you to be a part of that. And then finally, the last thing I want to shout out is BookTix. If you guys are not using BookTix as your ticketing services, I highly recommend you looking into them. They are wonderful humans, and they are sponsoring all of our classes for the month of April. All of ReTheater's programming for this month is done on a pay-what-you-can basis. If this has been something interesting and helpful to you, I'm going to put over in the chat a link. There is never a requirement to make any donations, so please don't think that, but anything that you can do to, if you are inspired to support artists, we would love that. Now that I've just talked for like 500,000 miles a minute, anybody have any questions? Let's chat about any questions anyone has, or any ahas or anything you want to add. Anybody have anything they want to chat about?
Well, I have to say, you really stuffed a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I'm impressed.
Oh, thanks, Mary. I feel like I just talked like triple the amount of speed I should.
Yeah. Who do you regret most leaving off the list personally?
So from like my own personal inspiration as far as musical theater goes, probably Bill T. Jones and his work with Spring Awakening and how he brought brought like much more traditional modern dance to the stage, and I think his work on that's beautiful. And then also Fela. But for my personal, probably him. But I think from like a more general, either it would be Jonathan Larson or Bobby Lopez. Who do you wish we would have put on there, Sean?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I think you covered pretty well. I mean, give me a second.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I was thinking that for choreographers, Michael Kidd, just being
Michael Kidd, yep.
such an athletic dancer and making his actors and actresses dance so much. And for male actors, I was thinking, I always say his last name wrong. Michael Service.
Oh,
Services.
is it?
I
I
think
can never
it's
say it either. Yes.
Michael Cerverus, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But everything that he's done, from creepy Sweeney Todd to the Dad in Fun Home, like just
Mhm.
what a career.
And Tommy, and
Yeah.
yeah. I did think of, so I mean, he kind of does a lot of different things, and I know he's not really called a choreographer, but more of a movement director. Stephen Hoggett, I think his work, especially in Spring Awakening, not Spring Awakening, American Idiot, and I mean his dance work. I mean, if anybody's, I know it's not a musical, but his work on Curious Incident really changed the game for how actors move on stage, and I just wish he would do more musicals, actually. But, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and actually, I thought you were gonna. I thought. I know it's hard because they're so well known for movies more, but how about Menken and Ashman?
Yeah, so Menken and Ashman were also on my list, and they were on. Knew I was going to run out of time, which clearly happened since I went up to the exact last moment. Menken and Ashman are really, really important, and I had another slide that was more about like the people that don't necessarily fit into a specific category because they've done so much, and they were on there because I mean from Little Shop, but also without them, Disney wouldn't have the footholding that it has today. And so, I mean, Steven Schwartz also is in that category. There's so many people. And I wish I could have talked about everyone because there's so many amazing people we had to leave out. But yeah.
But I'm so glad you brought up Sammy Cannell. She's, yeah.
Who?
I'm so glad you brought up Sammy Cannell. She's a hero of mine.
Oh yeah. I'm like.
Yeah, I put in the comments, like, you should Google, when she was in Stanford, she did a production of Violet on a bus.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
She is absolutely insane with her imagination. And I've talked to her several times and she's so chill and down to earth too. And just very like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, yeah, are you, what?
Yeah.
Some other directors
Yeah, and
with are like a little egomaniac.
Yeah.
And so not at all.
And you brought up that TED Talk. And my favorite part of that TED Talk is when she's talking about, she shows that video from that high school production of The New Argentina,
Yes.
where they have like, and I'm just like, I look at that, I'm like, I know what directors were thinking, like, oh, let's just get all the kids involved in it. But it really doesn't make sense to have the girls voting because that's what Ava was fighting for the entire show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to her, like going off of that, like, sorry if anyone's like talking about, but like her entire take into Evita was so fascinating in that she like really looked at like how Evita really impacted the country in a positive way without like overlooking the negatives. But I feel like she's oftentimes directed as such like a tragic female or also as like the antagonist. And while she was those things, she also really was heavily influential and inspiring to Argentina and was so far ahead of her time. And her death was tragic. So, and I think it's hard because people like, it's easy to like Che because they don't talk about any of the insane, horrible things that Che Guevara did. They just are like, look at this guy. He's totally cool and gets it. Whereas like, if we actually heard about Che Guevara in like the actual things he did.
And they never met.
They never met.
Like,
there may have been a meeting. There's like one possible time that they like possibly cross paths, but it is interesting.
Did you get to see that Evita at Encores?
No, it's very sore subject.
Okay. Yeah, because I was curious how, because with Another Suitcase in Another Hall, how she added in the younger Ava voices, and yeah.
No, I bought tickets for the last one, and of course the L train ruined my life by being stuck under the water for like 45 minutes. So.
Oh, I had tickets for Love Life.
Oh. No.
So upset. I know. And nobody ever does that. Like, what a
Yeah.
romantic and wonderful musical that nobody ever does. But last thing, and the other person just on the females performer list that I was like, oh, is Ethel Merman.
Yes. Yeah, I know. It's like there's so many. Like I have like pages right here of like people that I wanted to talk about.
I know. How do you fit it in?
Yeah, for sure. But it just goes to show like this art form is like so much more complex and involved than so many people think it is. Like Idina Menzel, you can
influential women class.
What?
You need a just influential women class.
Yeah.
I mean,
All about them. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'd love that.
We didn't talk about any of the new composers besides Lin-Manuel Miranda, like Pasek and Paul, like huge. Tom Kim, Brian Yorkie. You don't like them?
I think Pasek and Paul are only good because they're white men.
Really?
I mean, I especially look at people like Lisa Kron and Janine Tesori who like waited for so long to finally get their due. And I mean, I look at somebody like Pasek and Paul. First of all, I just don't like their music either, but like, I'm just like, yeah, I just think there's much better composers out there. And I think their privilege really gives them a foot up.
Interesting. That's so I either love or hate their music, but I feel like they really did work their way up, but I get why you don't think they did. That's fine. I mean, they did come from Carnegie Mellon, so there is that as well.
Was it Carnegie Mellon? I thought it was Michigan.
One of them came from Carnegie Mellon.
Mm.
I'm almost positive. Like my okay, so this is a funny story. There was a production of Dogfight that was done in Seattle area, and my boss and I used to he would take me because I would write review stuff and like help him. And so we went, and I was like angry about it because I love Dogfight for the last 15 minutes of it, and it just makes no sense. And so then we were at work, and I'm like, my reviews usually were like really snarky, which if you know me better makes sense. And I was like in the process of writing my review, and my boss was on the phone, and he was like, Lindsay, what do you think of Dogfight? And I was like, just like going off about the last 15 minutes, and he was talking to both of them and like me on speakerphone. So that was fun. That was good. But yeah.
Oh, they also robbed Lin of his EGOT because they won the Oscar for City of Stars over that Moana song. I forget which one, but it was a way better song.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Yeah, awesome. Any other thoughts or comments or anything anybody wants to add?
Do you think we can talk about some new composers when we talk about like what comes next? Like, can we talk about who we want to see get their shots on Broadway?
Yeah, for sure. Because there's a lot of folks like I would love to hear what you guys think. And we're from all over the United States. So if you know people regionally as well, I think calling on all of our like shared experience or our individual experiences as we talk about this will be really helpful because we want to like include as many perspectives as we can. Anything else? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and call it a day. Great. Well, thank you all so much. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to stick around. But I so appreciate y'all being here. And we'll see you guys one last time next week. All right. See you guys. I'm going to stop the recording.